I brought with me to show you firstly a replica of this tablet. It's not the real thing, but this is a life-size exact replica. And this is what was brought to me in the British Museum by a member of the public in 1985 or something. I'd never seen it before. I looked at it and I read the first line straight away, and I knew it was part of the Babylonian flood story. But then the man took it away from the museum. He took it home, and I didn't see it again for quite a long time. But when he brought it in again and let me have a proper look at it, I was able to decipher the whole thing, and it was full of amazing new material.
Now, I know you've studied this ancient text, one of the earliest forms of writing, for years and years and years. You've dedicated your life to it. How long did it take you to translate this text?
Well, when I finally got it in my hands, I could read most of it within a few days. But the fact is that the surface is damaged. Some of the signs are very difficult, so I had to go back to it and go back to it. Every time I had a bright idea, another little bit would come out, and eventually I think I got as much out of it as is humanly possible. Okay,
now one of the most startling discoveries you made from this translation is that the plans for the Ark showed that it was to be built round. It was to be round. This is such a departure from the classic stories that we've grown up with.
Well, it's a funny thing, because anyone who's read their Bible knows that Noah's Ark was a kind of oblong-shaped craft. And anybody who ever grew up in any kind of normal house knows what Noah's Ark really looks like, which is a boat with a high front and a high stern with a little house in the middle. Everybody knows both of those images.
Yes.
And I don't think anybody had ever had the idea that the Ark, in its original form, so to speak, might have been a round vessel. So when I first read this, I was astonished. But you see, what happened is, when you start to think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Because a round vessel is a coracle, which is a traditional kind of boat you often find on rivers round the world. And the ancient Babylonians had these coracles. So the poet who wrote the story of the flood on this particular tablet, his answer to what was this boat like was, well, it must have been a coracle, but an absolutely gigantic one, so there'd be room for all the animals. And the thing about a coracle is this: you know, it's a round vessel from above, and it's shaped a bit like this. So when it's in the water, it will float always. It will never sink. And that's all that the Ark, either Noah's Ark or the Babylonian Ark, had to do, was to bob around safely like a lifeboat with all the animals inside until the waters went away again. Didn't have to go from London to New York, as you might expect.
Right. It was, as you said, a lifeboat. Now, what's interesting, even though you translated this text, you say that you're 107% sure that this Ark never existed, that it was never built. Why is that?
Well, I'll tell you why. Because the measurements are very clear, and the surface area of this giant coracle was about half the size of an English football field. So it's a gigantic thing, but the point is that this is mythology we're talking about. It's not a blueprint for reality. It's a mythological story where one of the poets went to a lot of trouble to create a realistic idea of a gigantic boat. So what I think is that in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, which is the homeland of this story, there certainly were very destructive floods, and probably maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago there was once a kind of tsunami which swept across the whole landscape and took all the towns and villages away down to the Persian Gulf. And I think that for the survivors, the memory of this great deluge, which really happened, never disappeared from their minds, and it was passed on for generations and generations. And it's that in the background which then led, I think, to the mythological story of how the animals were saved in a boat. Exactly.
Now, obviously, we know the turmoil that is going on and has been going on for some time in Iraq. I imagine you're concerned that discoveries such as this from that area, from what was ancient Mesopotamia, are more rare and are going to be harder to get access to.
Well, that's true, but the fact is, in the British Museum where I work, we have about 130,000 pieces of clay with writing on, because when this archaeology began in the 19th century, the excavations found huge quantities of inscriptions, and a lot of them came to the British Museum. So that means that we have lots and lots of tablets still to be read. Not everything has already been
You got your work cut out for you.
But you're right. Absolutely. I think you have to live for 500 years yourself in order to do the job properly.